Alright, I'm just doing some test fitting here. I know this should be pretty close on the pommel. So as far as it goes on, there must be a little burr on the inside of that. It just keeps it from pushing on any further, but I'm going to bevel out this connection and weld this together. Couldn't ask for much better than that. There is no wiggle in that whatsoever. It feels like one solid piece. Alright, so we're just doing some test fitting here. Doing some final mock-up. You can see all the beveled areas that I have gouged out. This is going to be, you know, probably 2 passes of weld in each of these beveled areas, all on the inside, the outside, so on and so forth. Even on the front side there. Just making sure I didn't leave any gaps or forget any parts. Looks pretty good to me. I'm pretty happy with it. I'll put you on the tripod real quick here. This is only loosely clamped together, so I have to be careful here. But that's going to slide in like that. And then this collar will come in. Should cover up any nastiness. And that's pretty much it. Okay, so we're getting the handle lined up here. It's not actually a ton of work because this slot was milled out pretty precisely. It's centered perfectly and, you know, angled side to side. I've checked it, it's basically perfect. The only thing I had to do was kind of level it because it just sags. No matter how hard I clamp it, it's trying to kind of fall at that end. So what I use in these cases is basically an angle finder. 0 degrees, 0 degrees, yeah, I'd say that's pretty good. Alright, so that didn't go too badly. I tacked it in 4 places on top, 4 places on bottom. I've rechecked the squareness and everything. Everything looks good. The only thing left to do is I'm going to take the big old torch and I'm going to preheat these giant chunks of steel, probably 500 degrees or so. Well, that's that. I think that weld came out pretty well. Laid down nice and flat. It's almost even with the surface. I just gotta kind of buzz it with the grinder on both sides. And then I'll get to work on mocking up the handguards and tacking them in place. Okay, this looks like a bit of a mess, but what I did is I used these magnets to line everything up perfectly, and then I clamped everything in place. Everything laid nice and flat, but I just wanted to be really sure, especially, you know, that seam right there that isn't going to get welded. Need it to lay as flat as possible, and I don't want it to move once I start tacking it and so forth. There's going to be a lot of little welds, especially on these ends here, in and outside of all these joints. So I'm going to tack this thing together, get some of the clamps off there, and then fully weld it. And I guess I'll let it cool. It's getting a quarter to midnight. I'll let it cool overnight and then we'll work on grinding and machining off all the welds. You know, it's funny, about 6 months ago on Craigslist, a pair of matched machining vices showed up, and the price was really good. I never thought I would ever need them, but I picked them up anyway, and I'm awfully glad because they're perfect for this project. They are exactly the same height, exactly the same size, everything. They're the same model. The serial number, they're actually only about 100 apart on the two of these things, so I've got these lined up so that the blade is perfectly parallel with the movement of the machine. So what I'm going to do here, I'm actually going to use this cutter mainly for the inside, cleaning up the weld on top and in these corners. Getting these perfect 90-degree corners by hand is very difficult because one misstep and you kind of created a compounding problem. Like, see this little vertical surface right here? If I were trying to, you know, grind away this weld and I did a little too much, there would be a notch, you know, right there, and then I'd have to blend it in. But then going the other way, you know, the horizontal surface here, I'm trying to file away the surface and I dig into this again, I've created a notch here and a notch here, and it just kind of keeps going. You keep removing more material to try to correct the previous mistake, so on and so forth, and then it just kind of, it never looks quite right. And you can see here what I was talking about. I've got basically perfect 90-degree transitions, you know, in the corners. I've got no notches taken out of the edges. It basically looks perfect. I mean, there's a few little flaws here and there, you can see right there. But all these corners are going to get filed down. I don't need these razor sharp machined edges. There's another one right there, just a tiny little thing right there. But this will all get smoothed out. But this is a nice base to start with, I think. Okay, on second thought, I am going to try to machine off this weld here. I'm going to lay it down like this so I'm not putting so much force. You know, when it was standing up tall, it could tip over basically by trying to cut all this length at the same time. I would have to take it in little nibbles basically, you know, half-inch deep, half-inch deep, half-inch deep. It would just take forever, and I'd have to use a really long end mill, which had a high likelihood of breaking. But laying it down like this, I can use this end mill. It's got just enough travel, or just enough length basically, cutting length. Just protrudes maybe 1/8 of an inch or so, so I can cut off all that weld in basically one pass, or rather two because the handle's in the way. But I never really get to use tools this big. This is a 7/8 inch end mill. This is a half-inch end mill, which I was just using for all the other operations. You could see the beefiness, just an excuse to play with some new tools basically. I don't think I've ever actually used an end mill this big before. A possibly mildly interesting sub note here. I've never actually done this before, but you can remove these jaws on the vise and you can put them on the outside. So I'm actually clamping this right here and right here, and the vise body is actually underneath it. You can see here, this doesn't have the vise jaws attached, but there's mounting holes where they go. I just have this resting on this vise with a piece of, this is 7/16, it's the same size as this, so that way it shims it nice and level. I did measure it, it's within 1/10 of a degree of level. And I've just got these clamps on here, the brass pads, that just to keep it from marking up, you know, the blade. And I have this here, it's actually, got this grabbing the webbing basically of the casting here. I didn't want to clamp on this nice flat machine perfectly smooth surface of the bottom of the vise and, you know, risk digging into it or marring it up. So I just got this clamped down to keep everything stable. It's really only clamped in the vise right there, but all the milling forces are this way, so I don't expect it to move. Alright, here we go with the end result. I obviously didn't go crazy on machining this perfectly. I mean, some spots it came out nearly perfect, but there's this I don't know, this might be 15, 20 thousandths of an inch, maybe half a millimeter left in some spots. I'm just going to do this by hand, and obviously this big lumpy bumpy stuff by hand, but I think that cut down a lot of the work, and I got a nice kind of flat reference surface to work off of. And it looks pretty good. You know, of course, I managed to do all this welding all along all these perimeters and everything, and I don't have any pinholes, no defects. Usually I have something. I have to, you know, die grind out a little spot, re-weld it, re-grind it back, but it's basically perfect. I didn't have to do any repairs anywhere. And then I went, and while doing this grinding, I just slipped and I just cut in with the grinder right there, and I actually did it the other way, a little narrower spot right there. But so now I got to build up this edge again, and just to grind it back when I'm, you know, 95% done with the whole thing. But that's the way it goes. Alright, well, that's just about it for the sword. All the welding, grinding, sanding, finishing, you know, polishing is done. Maybe the last 1% of it when I have it completely done before I ship it, but yeah, you get the idea. Alright, so we are on to the hand wrap. Now, I usually do this in red, but after really looking at some screenshots and referencing source material and talking to some people, thinking burgundy is a little more appropriate. A lot of people like to do these in a bright red, but I think it's a little bit much. It looks nice, but it's not quite canon. So what I've got is some burgundy leather. I think it's pretty close. I would like it to be a little bit more red, but this is as good as I can do, especially considering I am colorblind. Now, I usually use 3/4 inch wide strips. I found a manufacturer that can do these 1 inch wide strips. Now, the big advantage here is that I can possibly get this entire hand wrap done with just this one 6-foot long piece of leather. I calculated it, and it could do maybe to about there if I used every bit of the material. So it's a little thicker than normal, which is concerning, but I think it's going to be really, really, really close. Wish me luck, because I only bought one of these. Okay, so I was just cutting this and getting ready to apply it, and I decided at the last second to do an actual mock-up, and it turns out it's short. It ended right about there. So after puzzling through it, I realized that this stuff is much thicker than advertised. This was advertised as being 1/8 of an inch thick. It's nearly 50% thicker than that. So I'm going to do something kind of dumb and messy and smelly. I'm going to basically try to run this whole thing fairly consistently through that belt sander and make a huge mess, but also reduce the thickness of this leather by, again, roughly about 1/3, I guess. Not a ton of material, but that last 2 inches makes all the difference, right? Okay, take 2 on this. I have sanded this down to the advertised thickness, actually slightly under, just to give myself a little more room for error. This gave me 2 additional benefits. This leather is much more pliable now. I really kind of struggled when I was mocking it up. It's so thick that, you know, trying to wrap it around, it just didn't want to conform to the shape. So the thickness is much better now. And furthermore, I saved a little bit of weight, so wouldn't want the sword getting too heavy, right? pretty good. I did have one tiny little screw up right there. See this little tiny little gap where I had to cut this out. It's close, but not perfect. Not super happy with it, but realistically, I expect to have to replace this hand wrap after all the testing is done. So when I get this sword back from the testing, I'll just rip this all off. I'll replace this leather with the correct, consistent thickness leather. Hopefully, not something that's been done by hand. Although this does feel very consistent. I did spend quite a bit of time trying to make it perfect. But yeah, that's basically it. It's looking kind of ridiculous. Oh, and in case you're wondering, this is the scrap that was left after cutting it off. This is all I had for excess, so pretty much couldn't have cut it much closer than that. But it looks nice having a nice single continuous piece. I hate having that seam usually in this area, you know, where I have to join two pieces together. It just never looks quite right. I think it looks great now. Alright, let's see what we got here. Whew. Almost 123 pounds. Not too shabby. Do I look really tough? Alright, so needless to say, completely failed experiment. I don't know how much footage I'm going to show you, but even this is really strenuous and really painful. The edges of the sword, all the parts of it, just dig into everything. I mean, I'm just holding it and I can feel my arm shaking a little bit, and my voice is probably shaking. Most people would consider me to be a fairly strong person. I'm around 6'3", 210 pounds. I've been powerlifting for 7 years, but it ain't enough. This is 2, 3, 4 levels above my capability. So we're talking world-class strongman, maybe top 10. Let's see what happens. Okay, so full disclosure here, I am a complete idiot. I spent a whole chunk of change on this extremely expensive, extremely strong, long rifle case because it was just the right dimensions to fit the sword into it, but I've made a huge tiny mistake. You see the internal dimension of this is 10 inches wide, and the sword blade is 9.5 inches wide, so I figured I could just make it. However, I didn't really think about these guys that are hanging off the sides here. So, long story short, I've got some markings here. I'm going to have to trim this out with a Dremel, and hopefully there's enough case integrity left to hold together through shipment. Well, through some miracle, I managed to trim it just right on the first pass, so we're looking pretty good. It's a little rough, but it's got these areas in here and the handle so it can pass through as well. This doesn't look conspicuous at all. Giant rifle case with a long, skinny cylinder sticking out. Almost could be a flash suppressor on the end there. This definitely won't get inspected or anything, I'm sure. Alright, let's weigh this bad boy. It's kind of hidden by the thing here, sorry. 140.6. We are under the UPS limit of 150 pounds, so it's a little buffer room to spare. Alright guys, that's it. I will link to the associated videos. They'll be up here somewhere, and I'll also include them in the description when they're available. I had a lot of fun making this thing, a lot of fun trying to lift it. Well, less fun and more excruciating, but it is what it is. I hope you enjoyed it. See you guys next time.